Welcome. I hope you are having a wonderful night, dear viewer. Tonight, I will be telling some terrifyingly scary stories. Make sure to leave your feedback on the comments so I can make this the best experience for you. And if you have any stories you would like me to tell, you can send them through the link in the description. Let's begin. Story 1. This is not my story, but was told to me by my grandparents and corroborated by my mother. Now, my grandparents are, and were, both Catholics and have been for many years. My grandpa in particular is very devout and has always done what he feels the Lord has led him to do. Due to this, an incident took place in their house that led up to the event that is the core of this story. That is a tale for another time, but it involved an exorcism without proper precautions taken, resulting in a haunted house. They continued to live there for a few years and relayed several happenings to me from their time in that house. The incident I will now recount happened many years ago when my mother was a young girl. She had 2 brothers, and at the time, they had a dog. I've forgotten her name. But for the sake of the story, let's call her Millie. It was something sweet and generic like that anyway. Millie was a mixed breed and possibly had some shepherd or collie in her, since she was apparently extremely smart. At the time, things were a lot safer in that town than they are now. My grandparents would often leave the back door unlocked at night. Millie, who had taught herself to open the door, would then come into the house and lie in her usual spot on my mother's middle brother's floor. Let's call him Harry. Because my grandparents preferred to keep Millie outside in the summer, they instructed the 3 children to keep the door locked in the evening as a rule. One night in midsummer, everyone went to bed as usual. The family had mostly been remembering to lock the back door, but occasionally, someone would still forget, and Millie would let herself in. On this particular night, sometime around midnight, Harry awoke to the sound of claws clicking on wood in the hallway. He figured that someone had forgotten to lock the door again, and that subsequently, Millie was coming to his room. So he didn't open his eyes at first, instead trying to get back to sleep. He then heard the sound of clicking draw nearer, only to cease as the dog reached his carpeted bedroom. Harry listened to her turn her usual few circles before curling up on the floor beside where he was lying. However, after a few minutes of trying, Harry found that he couldn't get back to sleep. There was an odd feeling pricking the hairs at the back of his neck that he just couldn't shake. Nervously, he called for Millie to come over, hoping to reassure himself by giving her some pets, when she didn't approach at his call as she usually would. He reluctantly opened one eye to look at her. Harry later told me that he froze in horror, his childish brain unable to comprehend what he was seeing. Millie was nothing more than a dark shape curled on his floor, but he could see that she was looking at him intently. The problem was that her eyes were no longer soft honey brown, but glowing an awful sickly red color. She didn't blink. Terrified, but unable to move, Harry closed his eyes and pulled the duvet up over his head, saying silent prayers against the Millie thing on his floor since he was too afraid to yell for his parents. Eventually, the pull of sleep overcame his panic, and Harry let the darkness take him, although he recalled having many nightmares. In the morning, Harry woke and looked fearfully at a carpet, expecting to see Millie lying there. When she was not, he supposed that he could have dreamed the whole episode, a fact that he later refuted by the presence of dirty paw prints on his carpet. Or else someone had let her out while he had been asleep. He then made his way into the kitchen for breakfast as usual. Upon entering, everyone else, my grandparents, my mother, and their older brother, were at the table eating. Harry came in and sat with them, and they talked for a while until my gran got up and opened the door for Millie, who came bounding in happily with her tail wagging, before settling at her food bowl to wait for her own breakfast. Harry thought this was odd, since she would have already eaten if his parents had gotten up earlier to let her out, and he decided to ask them about it, querying whether someone had forgotten to lock the door again the previous night. The family looked at him quizzically before my gran told him that no. She was sick of everyone forgetting to lock the back door at night, so she had done it herself and then double-checked it again after everybody else went to bed. Slowly, Harry's blood turned to ice in his veins as he realized that whatever had been in his room that night, it had not been Millie. At least, not the real Millie. That was only one of the several things relayed to me by my mother and grandparents on separate occasions, which they believe was a direct result of demonic activity within their house. Needless to say, they were all more than relieved when they moved out a few years later. Millie had passed away by then, but she otherwise lived a long and happy life. Story 2. I'll start by saying that nothing could have prepared me for what I was going to discover the morning after a night out. It started as every other night would. Me and my family got ready to head to our local bar for a fundraising event. I had just turned 18 and was looking forward to having a chill night with friends and family. I knew most of the people there, so I was feeling really relaxed. While at the bar, I went to pay for my drink when the bartender told me it had already been paid for. When I turned to see who had paid for it, I saw my cousin's partner. He was around 12 years older than me. Give or take, I gave him a quick wave, and we exchanged the usual niceties, like hi. How are you doing? It's important to note that I had barely spoken more than 2 words to him before, as he was usually quiet or retreated to his room when we would go and visit my cousin. After saying thank you, I thought nothing of it. Nothing seemed off with our little interaction. By the end of the night, I had gathered my family together and told them I wanted to head home. At this point in time, I was still living at home with my mother. She had made plans to stay at my grandmother's that night, so I was going to go home and sleep. It was around 11:30 p.m., and I was outside having a smoke, about to head to my car. Just as I was about to head to my car, I heard someone call my name, so I turned to find my cousin's partner walking towards me. He asked if I was heading home for the night, which I thought was weird, so I said it's late, and I was calling it a night. Without skipping a beat, he mentioned the car that I drive and said he would see me around sometime. At this point, I got a bit creeped out, so I said goodnight and walked off to my car. There were plenty of people outside, so I wasn't concerned at all. Once I got in the car, my phone went off, and it was my mother. She was begging and pleading with me to go and stay at my grandmother's house for the night, saying that she had a really bad feeling. Initially, I was really annoyed. I just wanted to go home and go to sleep in my own bed. But she insisted. I couldn't understand why. I was used to being alone at home at night, but she wouldn't let it go. I hung up and started driving home. I couldn't be bothered going to my grandma's when my house was just down the road. I was tired. I just wanted to go home. Not even halfway home, my phone went off again. So I pulled over to check it. It was my sister asking me to please go stay at my grandma's house. I was pissed off at this point and decided it would be easier to go to my grandma's house instead of arguing with my family. When I got to my grandma's house, everyone was asleep. Now, I was really pissed off and went straight to sleep. The night was uneventful, but I woke up in the morning to my family talking about how they all had a feeling of dread, which is why they didn't want me to go home alone that night. My mother and I left for home at lunch. I felt off as soon as we pulled into the driveway. Once I got to the door, I found a police card wedged into the door, instructing us to call them ASAP. I went inside and found my mother's camera on the kitchen table. This was a huge red flag, because it was in my bedroom before we left for the fundraiser. I went to my room to find my entire room had been ransacked. No other room in our house had been touched. My blankets had been pulled back, and it looked like someone had been in my bed. My underwear drawer was wide open, and some were also sprawled on the floor. Another camera of my mother's was also on the table where my TV was, directly opposite my bed. Clothes were everywhere. By this point, I was losing my shit. If I had gone home, like the plan all along, I would have made my way through the house and then crawled into bed without switching my lamp on. I had done this so many times previously, and I wouldn't have seen the state of my room at all. My mother called the police to find out what happened, and what she told me made the blood drain from my face. The police were alerted to a break, in at our next door neighbor's house when our neighbors found a man wandering inside their house. The man claimed he was my friend and went into the wrong house, and they chased him out. Our house had a big 8x12 deck, which looked over my neighbor's house. They called the police again when they spotted the same man having a smoke on our deck. The police arrived at our house at 2 a.m., but since I wasn't home, no one answered the door. They noticed the lights on, so they went inside to investigate. They made their way through the house and found a man hiding in my bedroom in the dark. He couldn't give a reason why he was there or why he was hiding in my room. They had arrested him and taken him to the station, and they wanted to know if we knew him. Turns out, it was my cousin's partner, and he had been hiding in my bedroom for over an hour, waiting for me to get home, because he knew I would be going home that night. My mother's gut feeling saved me from going home alone that night, and my neighbor's vigilance helped catch a creep. I always listen now without question whenever she has a bad feeling. Who knows what would have happened? All I know is it wouldn't have been pretty. He was charged with breaking and entering and spent some time in jail before being released and moving to another country. Always trust your mother's gut feeling. People. It sure saved me from having to deal with that. Story 3. This is a relatively old story that my dad has told me a few times over the years. But with Halloween coming up, it's been on my mind again. I myself have never been able to witness the house, though the description I've been given by multiple men, 20-something years after seeing it, gave me a very vivid mental image. To begin, I would like to mention that my father is a highly religious man, a preacher's son, and does not believe in ghosts or anything paranormal in the slightest. Nothing seems to spook him either, but he still swears up and down that he felt something unnatural that scared the crap out of him, even just from mentioning the story to me on the rare occasion that he would bring it up. Back in the late 80s, he and a few friends would regularly hike over the Waterfall Creek bed behind our farm, and would follow the trails up until they eventually met the frontage road off of the interstate. Well, one night, they decide to take a different route to go around the backside of another farmer's land, mostly to see the animals because they owned emus and other large pets that weren't common in the local area. Supposedly, after leaving the area and continuing into the woods, at night of all wonderful times, they managed to stumble upon what is described by all 5 men 20 years later as a Blair Witch look-alike house. It was a very, very old home, and my dad claims that just looking at it gave him this ominous feeling. But of course, they had to go inside and check it out. Inside the house was a vintage cottage-style home that was probably built in the late 40s or early 50s, and the group was instantly met with writing and symbols, in strange Latin-like, languages with a few English graffiti pieces that quoted a supposed satanic or pagan worshipping ritual, with certain pieces describing how to sacrifice a human soul to some supposedly demonic deity. My father still claims to this day that certain symbols were painted on the walls in blood, while others were clearly spray paint, and I find it easier to believe because he also worked as a firefighter for years before this happened, and had a lot of experience with having to see human blood and dismembered bodies on the freeway after car accidents. Past a small living kitchen area was a stairwell that was so small that their shoulders would physically brush either side of the wall as they went up, and the stairs went straight, stopped at a small landing, then turned right so as you started up, you could not see what might be standing at the top. At the top of the stairs, a door led to a large attic-style bedroom, where actual chain manacles and locks hung from one of the walls near a circular window at the end of the room, which was also completely covered in weird symbols, graffiti, and now more obvious and frightening, large dried puddles of blood that had seeped into the floors and walls. Allegedly, once they were upstairs investigating the room, they swear that they heard someone moving up the stairwell behind them quickly, but when they looked back, there was no one there. Everyone essentially told me that it sounded almost like heels clacking on wood, and now completely spooked. They rushed back down the stairs to see if someone was playing a prank on them and was hiding downstairs. Surprise, surprise, they found nothing and no new footprints in the dust and grime that differed from the ones they left on their way in. To keep things interesting, I met with each of the guys separately to ask them about what they remembered, expecting to maybe find a crack or something to prove that maybe they were exaggerating. But when I asked them, I got the same answer from each of them, with no hesitation. They got the same details right down to the minute that they entered the house and the minute they left. But here's where it gets really strange. They left the house and for some unknown reason decided to try walking back from a different route using a compass to approach from the east instead of the south. They did this test more than 10 times that night, walking from every possible route or direction. Yet they always came out at the front entrance of the house, even when the compass and common knowledge of the area showed that it was physically impossible to be at the south end of the house, when they moved in a straight line from the north, east, or west. There probably is some scientific explanation for it, but I haven't found one yet. These guys knew those woods literally like the back of their hand, and still do to this day. The final time that the guys came back and found themselves standing at the front door of the house, they begin to feel physically ill, verging on feverish, and finally decide that it's time to give up when one of them nearly faints, and as they turn to leave, the man who nearly fainted turns, looks up and points at the circular window at the front of the house on the second story. Everyone looks and immediately sees a tall female figure hunched over standing in the window, watching them, though they see no features on her face other than two large dark-colored eyes, and it sort of shuffled in place, slight before turning and walking away, as if it were heading to the stairs queue, the end of the room. At the sight of the figure actually moving, they all took off, running through the woods, ending up on the side of the interstate about 3 miles from my dad's house, where they originally started from. They eventually made it back to my dad's place, though they claimed that they felt as if someone were following them the entire way. And my dad's cousin gets up to get some water from the kitchen, only to announce that he swore that he saw the same figure standing outside of the kitchen window near the edge of the woods, close to the woodshed. Thankfully, nothing ever came from the experience other than a collective state of absolute terror when the subject is brought up. They wrote off what his cousin saw as paranoia or pareidolia, though 5 years later, they decided to return to see if the house was still standing. Miraculously, it had fallen in on itself and was nothing more than a pile of rubble, and they never went back. I always joked with my dad and would ask him what he would do if he went back and found the house standing the same way it had back then, trying to give him a reason to let me go and see the place for myself. But with trespassing laws being far more prevalent in today's times, it would be nearly impossible without either getting shot or going to jail, as it was not on our property. I don't know. It always gives me the creeps thinking about it. But I never considered the story to be true until I did this little mock interview with all of the guys. And when I say that these grown men are scared to death by this story, I mean it. Seeing them get physically worked up and frightened by just telling the story really caused me to be less of a skeptic. What do you guys think? Could it possible that they were just spooked and it caused them to see things?